All right. Let me know if you can't see that screen, but I'll assume you can. Hi, my name is Tom Helmuth. Today I'll be presenting research that I conducted with Eddie Pantridge, Grace Wolson, and Lee Spector in the area of genetic programming. So for those of you not familiar with genetic programming, the general idea is that we want to evolve a population of computer programs. And in particular, the goal in the work I'm doing is looking for a program that passes a set of specifications that are defined as input and output examples. And so in other words, we want to, for each of these input examples, run the program and have the output be the desired output given with the examples. This work particularly looks at program synthesis, which is the idea of using genetic programming to write the types of programs that we expect humans to write. In other words, we want to evolve programs that have multiple data types, strings, booleans, integers, lists of all of the above, as well as different control flow structures, conditional execution, iteration, recursion, etc. And so the thing that we're going to concentrate on in this study is looking at the genetic source. And what I mean by genetic source is the way that we create new genes to be included in programs, where genes can be things such as instructions, constants, inputs, those types of things. Now, we toyed with a few different terms here. We thought about using the term gene pool, but I think gene pool, to me at least, refers a bit more to the genes that are present in the current population, where the genetic source more refers to genes that can be included as new genes within programs. So these aren't genes that are currently in the population, they're genes from an external source. Now, the genetic source defines which genes are available, in other words, what, say, instructions we can include in programs, as well as how often each of these genes will be used, how often each gene will be used in any given program. And these genetic sources are used in two settings. One is for the initial random programs, and the second is during mutation. So during evolution, if we need to create take a parent program, mutate it, and create a child program, we will use genes from the genetic source. So this leads us to two research questions that we tackled in this paper. The first of these is, do the compositions of genetic sources matter? Now, conventional wisdom in genetic programming has been that they don't actually matter all that much, because whatever genes are in the initial population, the good genes, the beneficial genes, will be amplified based on selection and carried throughout evolution. And so the actual composition of the genetic source doesn't matter all that much. Now, in this work, we find that actually the opposite is true, that the genetic source has a pretty big effect on the performance of genetic programming. And so then we look into a second question, which is, can we develop a way to automatically tune the genetic sources to have better compositions, so that we, instead of, say, hand tuning the source, can we automatically tune it to get better performance? And the way we developed for doing this is to use transfer learning of solutions to other problems when trying to solve a new problem. I'll talk more about that in a minute. So before we get into some results, I do want to talk about our experimental methods. Here we're using a set of benchmark problems called the General Program Synthesis Benchmark Suite. This is a set of benchmark problems of the types that we expect humans to write. In fact, all of the problems in this suite came from introductory computer science textbooks. So they are the types that humans expect to write when they're learning to program. To solve these problems, we use the Push Genetic Programming System, which is a genetic programming system developed specifically for use in, the Push programming language is a language developed specifically for use in genetic programming. And it works well for this type of problem because it allows us to use multiple data types, control flow structures, and the types of things we need when solving this type of problem. I've included our parameters here. At the bottom, the one thing that I do want to make sure I point out is that in this work, we're only using one genetic operator, one way of creating new children from parents. And this is a uniform mutation operator that uses additions and deletions. You'll note that we didn't use any crossover here, which is a bit unusual for genetic programming, simply because for pushGP, this has been, at least at this point, shown to be the best operator that we know of for solving this type of problem. Now, since we are using mutation only, that means that the genetic source is going to come into play throughout evolution. So the first question that we want to tackle is, do the compositions of genetic sources matter? And I'm going to talk about 4 different genetic sources, 2 of which over here on the left side, I will say these are reasonable ways of composing a genetic source to solve a new problem. And over here on the right side are 2 methods that I really would consider unreasonable to use if you're trying to tackle a new problem that you've never solved before. We'll talk about why that is in a minute. First of all, for the reasonable methods, we have what we call the kitchen sink approach. And this simply says, just use all instructions that are available to you, including the kitchen sink. And so in other words, we're not at all taking the particular problem into account with this approach. We instead just throw in all of the instructions that we have available. And because of that, this is the largest of the genetic sources that we look at in this work. Next up is the type-tuned genetic source. And here, essentially what we do is look at the problem and determine what data types are relevant to that problem. Maybe for problem A, you could imagine using strings and characters and integers. And so therefore you include all instructions that touch strings and integers and characters, and you don't include instructions, say, for vectors of Booleans. So once you've determined which types are useful, you then use all available instructions that make use of those types. Now, this is the standard that's been used in prior studies, and so we'll use this as our sort of main comparison point in the experiments presented here. So now let's turn over to the unreasonable methods. The first of these is hand tuning, and essentially what happened is I went through and looked at each problem. I have a lot of experience with these problems, and I just decided I think these particular instructions would be useful here. Now, this would not be a reasonable method if you're tackling a new problem that you don't know how to solve, or even worse, if you're giving the system to someone to do automatic programming, and if there's someone who's not a programmer in the first place. And so that wouldn't be a reasonable way. The second unreasonable method, which we call solution tuned, is that we solved the problem once, actually solved each problem a bunch of times, and then took solutions to the problem itself and used the instructions in those programs as the genetic source in a new set of runs. In other words, we solve problem A a bunch of times, we take instructions from those solutions and use them to solve problem A yet again. Now, of course, you couldn't use this to solve a new problem because you haven't solved the problem before, and so you don't have solutions you can use in this way. Now, the reason we look at both of these unreasonable methods is that they'll give us an ability to see what is the range of sort of genetic sources and their influence on performance of the system. And so we can go all the way from kitchen sink down to hand-tuned and solution-tuned. We're going to get an idea of how good we could do if we were able to do a really good job at tuning our sources. So let's go ahead and take a look at some results. And the main thing that we found here is that genetic sources do matter a lot. In this graph, on the x-axis down here, we have 25 different benchmark problems. And on the y-axis, we have the number of successful genetic programming runs out of 100. You'll notice that if we look at comparing just kitchen sink and type-tuned genetic sources, on almost every single one of these problems, we see that there is better performance using type-tuned, and often it's not even close, a significant difference between the two. So we see that if we don't do any tuning and just use all instructions, it sort of dilutes the useful instructions too much and will give us worse performance in our genetic programming system. On the other hand, if we look at the hand-tuned and solution-tuned instruction sets, we see that they on almost every single problem, one or both of them significantly outperforms the type-tuned genetic sources. And so this really shows us that if we are able to intelligently tune our genetic sources automatically, hopefully not with one of these two methods, then we should hopefully be able to see improved performance in our systems. And so this leads us to thinking about how could we actually do this tuning automatically. And our idea here is that instead of borrowing genes from a problem we've already solved, like with solution-tuned genetic sources, what if we borrow genes from previously solved problems in the same domain, but not the problem itself? In other words, we transfer the genes from solution programs to one problem to the genetic source of another problem. And so in this experiment, what we did was we took each of our 25 benchmark problems, and let's say you're trying to solve problem A. We then use solutions to the other 24 problems combined and use that as our genetic source. So we're not actually using solutions from the problem we're trying to solve, just solutions to the other problems. Now, there's a bunch of things we need to be careful about to make sure that each problem contributes equally to this genetic source. We go through all of those details in the paper. So let's look at some results. Here we're just comparing type-tuned, which is sort of the standard that's been used in previous studies, to transfer-learned genetic sources. And I've marked the problems that have significant improvements using transfer learning with a little sun above them. And so we'll see that there's 8 problems here where we saw significant improvements in performance when using the transfer learned genetic sources. So this really shows us that yes, transfer learning can be beneficial here. There were no cases where the type-tuned genetic source was significantly better than the transfer learning. And so our conclusions are that the genetic sources matter a lot, and that one way we can use to automatically tune them is by using transfer learning from other solved problems. Now, this leaves a few open questions. One of those is, are there other ways to tune genetic sources? Could we use other machine learning methods? Could we learn things about the problems themselves? Could we use those types of things to tune the genetic sources perhaps better than using transfer learning here? The other thing that we think would be interesting to look at is whether this transfer learning of genetic sources could be useful in other evolutionary computation or artificial life systems. For example, maybe you have a system where you have a uniform distribution of instructions that you use. Maybe using some other distribution may lead to improved performance. Thank you very much. I'd be happy to answer any questions you have.
Great, thank you so much, Tom. So there's a question in the chat from Alex. Alex, would you like to go ahead and ask your question?
Sure, yeah. Tom, great talk. So I was wondering if you guys looked at, was there a pattern in the sorts of instructions that turned out to be really useful to bias toward?
That's a great question. So in the paper, we link to a repository that has all of the distributions of instructions that we found. And there wasn't much pattern that we made notice of. So for example, one thing I wondered was when we go back and look at the problems that were better off when we're using transfer learning, I was wondering maybe all of these problems have something in common and those transfer learning instructions are useful there. Maybe, for example, maybe they all use strings and therefore you'd see more string instructions and see improvements there. But when we went through, when we looked at the problems, it didn't, at least I didn't notice anything that sort of was in common between these problems. So for example, they all require different data types. They all have different, well, they have different data type outputs between the different problems. And then when we looked at the instructions, there's certainly instructions that are more common than others, but there wasn't anything in particular that I saw that made me think, oh, we need to just include instructions of type A and that would lead to improvements.
Okay, great, thanks. We do have to move on to stay on schedule. I see Oscar has a question. If you want to go ahead and type it either in the chat or in the Slack for the talks, then that would be a great way to get your question answered. So Tom, you may want to pay attention to the chat.
Great, will do.
Cool. So next